Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. It's Tuesday. It's the last Tuesday in October. So, of course, it's time for Tuesdays for Teachers. I'm Daphne Atkinson, and I am joined by my colleague, Debbie Fawcett, and a consultant of ours who is part of an essential part of our PD team, um, Susan Pittman. And today we're going to talk about score reports. Specifically, we couldn't avoid the Halloween reference. So, welcome to Trick or Treat Mining GED Ready Score Report. What we're going to do in the time that we have available is to analyze real GED Ready score reports. We're going to talk about the why and the essential how of using score reports, particularly because once you select a publisher and publisher materials, there are some very detailed prescriptions that you can use to drive instruction. And as we always do, we're going to share some ideas and resources. Susan, what have we heard about how and when folks use the score reports?
Well, definitely there's a number of different things. Most of the time, what people do is they really are looking for that magic number. They want to see if it's on the operational test. They want to see, did they hit that 145? Or if it's the GED Ready practice test, they want to know how close are students in this, or are they likely to pass? But, they kind of, sometimes they will turn around and they look at it, and they look at it from a standpoint of, okay, can I get a feel for what work needs to be done? Are there some things, skills and content that I can do? And then other times, they'll look at scores. So, they will have taken the GED Ready, and then they take the GED operational test, and they look to see kind of how that matchup is. And we know that GED Ready is very much the predictor of what students are going to be able to do when they get to the operational test. But unfortunately, we don't see as much use out of those score reports as we really should, because a lot of times people think it's a little on the generic side, and they're not exactly sure how best to go about taking advantage of that and using that. Now, yes, they do, as you mentioned just a minute ago. If they have certain materials, well, then that tells them to go to certain pages within that. But there's a little bit more analysis that could actually be done if we really know how to look at those and really spend some time with it. So, as we're going through, if we think about, and let's start with the GED Ready score reports, because, we don't want students going in to take the operational test when they're not ready. So using that GED Ready, we know it's very predictive. We know that format is the same. Yes, it is half length, but that's okay, because students are getting that opportunity, to really be in that test environment and understand those types of questions that are there, how things are presented. And it really can tell us a lot of information about what's going on and how we can spend those final days or weeks that we have students to get them to the point where they really are comfortable in getting ready to take that operational test. But the other thing is that if we look at it carefully, we can see where we need to maybe make some changes, what we can do to make sure that students really are addressing the skills that they need, and that they're going to have a very successful experience when they actually take the test. So, Daphne, I know that they've done things over time, and they've really enhanced that score report. So how about talking a little bit about what that really looks like?
Susan, thanks. I mean, and you're right on target with the importance of these GED Ready score reports. As you can see, the GED test column is grayed out because we're really going to focus on the practice test. But I will call your attention to the fact that it has exactly the same components as the operational test score report. So the score is delivered in terms of a number, but that number is assigned to a range. So you know whether somebody is likely to pass a green zone score, too close to call, a yellow zone score, or not likely to pass, a red zone score. And I'm going to say that as you'll see in the slides that follow, we're really going to focus on the too close to call folks. And there's a reason for that, because they are most likely to roll the dice and take a chance that they're ready for operational testing. And I hope by the time we finish this webinar, you'll see that as instructors, you can play a vital role in helping students really address their the deficits in skills before they go to operational testing. Because as we all know, the disappointment of a failed operational test really shakes a test taker's confidence. And when they sit for an operational test, we want to have them in the best possible position, as Susan said, to have a successful testing event. So these sections of the score report are really vital. Students, we did some research in the last year, and there's some very sophisticated optical software that can read where the eyes are going when a score report appears on the screen. And you won't be surprised to know that the place the eye goes first is to the score, to the actual score, the numerical score, and that's where it lingers, at least initially, the most. And next, the how I can score higher category. This actually lays out for folks what needs work before taking the operational test. And this is the place that it's really worthwhile for students to have an instructor working with them to deconstruct what it is they have to work on. The students, when we interviewed them as part of focus groups, they were less convinced of the importance of what my score means, because that pretty much tells them what they have demonstrated successfully. And then there's a last piece that is important for the reasoning through language arts, and that is where you can access the test taker's written response to the extended response items. And one of the things that you as instructors can do is to print those out, go to the website and access both the stimulus material and the prompts, so that you can actually use the scoring tool to score those written responses. And those are really important for several reasons. One is that one of the things that has been a factor in constructive response since we introduced it in 2014 is students not writing enough. And one of the valuable pieces of feedback that you as instructors can give a student of yours is the news that you haven't really written enough. And that is invaluable feedback to work with and work through before someone goes to operational testing. Now, I will tell you that we have great news. Some of you who were already on I think we did this in August, Tuesdays for Teachers, you know that we're going to be introducing some enhancements to the RLA constructive response screens starting in January. And one of those enhancements is that the input box for the response now looks like a Word document so that a student can actually see how much they've written. And one of the things the research showed that we had done was that students were being subtly influenced by the size of the input box. And despite all of the information that we provided to students about the capacity of the box being, virtually infinite, it really didn't move the needle in the way that the initial user research that we've done about the input screen, as students could see how much they'd written, and the real estate for writing was made more visible to them, they actually wrote more. So we're really encouraged by those particular changes. So, Susan, how can you build a passer? What is it that can help us help students move from being not so confident to, as Devin, who's one of our GED grads, is giving the thumbs up?
Well, there's a couple of different things, but it really does start with the fact that we as instructors really need to spend a little bit more time reviewing score reports, because we need to kind of dig down into them, get used to where everything is, so that we can look at, really look at the details to see what skills the students demonstrate, but also, those skills where they need to do some work. So we can compare results and look at those similarities and differences. We can use those score reports to sit down and have a conversation with students about when they can retest. But not only that, to really talk to them about, what they're doing and what their goals are. I always like to think about, as we're working with students, if we have students who have aspirations to move on to higher education and technical training, then these score reports can tell us a lot in terms of where is that student in terms of being, at a place where they could be college and career ready. What skills do we need to add to that? So I think there's a lot that can be done from there. But beyond that, we do know that the publishers, they've actually, helped develop these, and we'll put it in parentheses, these prescriptions, where if students are missing certain skills, then they can go back and here's actually the skill that they need to work on, and here's the page number, and you can work from there. Now, we know that beyond just doing stuff from the books, we need to do some engagement with students, but this is a way, too, for you as the instructor to sit there and say, okay, I'm seeing these score reports coming back from the GED Ready, and I seem to be seeing some patterns here that are occurring. Well, maybe that's where I want to turn around and I want to go back and maybe do some little small group sessions on certain topics. But, the other thing is that what we have to do, because, our students can get very discouraged. They can be, looking at things and saying, well, if I couldn't do it this time, then what's the point? Because they've had failures and they've had struggles. And so what we can help them do with this is to show, okay, here's where you did really well. And then these are the things we need to work on so that students see that, you know what, I don't have to worry about everything. I have opportunities. I can move on from this. So we can actually discourage some of that, from that disappointment that students often have. But we really can use these different things, to get students motivated and to say, wow, look at what all you're doing and how we can help with that. So, there's just a lot of different things that are possibilities. But first, we have to understand those score reports and spend some time with them. And so that kind of leads us into another thing where we take a look at instruction, where, if we talk about, why certain things are happened and why there's a problem, how we're going to address that, and make sure that our students have plenty of practice, because for many students, it's not that they don't necessarily know a given skill, but they don't own that skill. In other words, they're real inconsistent with being able to apply it. But if we can put those three things together, we can help them build that confidence that they need and the skills that they need. So, from there, it's really a matter of putting together an action plan. And where we really look at three components, where we review, we diagnose, and we prescribe. And, for those of you who are out there in so many programs and you either use CASAS as an entrance test or you use TABE as an entrance test for students that are coming into your program under the WIOA guidelines, you do that same thing when you're looking at those results. Well, let's use our GED Ready, where we have such immense amount of information, and do exactly the same thing. Let's make sure that we're very concrete, that we show the connections, but also as we're looking at this, that we're able to see here's really some issues that we have with that a student has with given skills, and how can we change that? Maybe in some cases, I, as the instructor, have to look at a different way of presenting something. Maybe there's something that's just not clicking with that student in the way that I'm doing things. And that leads us to putting together those learning experiences that students need so that they truly can improve as they're moving along. So, I'm not going to say that, this is, just real quick and easy. It can be, the more that we understand all of those different little pieces that are involved in that score report. So first things first is to get out and start working with those. So, but underneath a lot of things, and this is just something that I think all of us as instructors have to think about, is that I don't care if you're teaching math or if you're the social studies or science teacher. Underneath all of this is the fact that our students really need to improve their reading skills. And so what we're going to talk about for a little bit is about this fundamental that students need and how that's going to be critical as we move through and our students have success within the tests and within your program itself, and as things as they move on into the future. Because our reading skills, yes, they are fundamental, but think about how that impacts higher order thinking skills. And that comes into play with whether you're critical thinking or you're problem solving. It's at the heart of all content. If you can't read and understand a word problem, that's not going to get you to the answer. You have to be able to recognize that vocabulary and understand the context in which things are done. And so, we often talk about how important algebra is as far as this gatekeeper when students move on into post-secondary. But those reading skills are just as essential as that underpinning for everything. So I want you to think in terms of how do we spread this out across the area? Because I think what you're going to see as we start diving into the different content areas, you're going to keep coming back to some of the same things over and over and over again where students are having some difficulty. So, Daphne, what is it that proficient readers can do? What is it that they need to be doing?
Right, and thanks for making that bridge, because the reading skill sort of knits together all of the content areas. A proficient reader who is also likely to be a proficient writer, because they're really two sides of the skill set, is really two sides of the same coin. But a proficient reader can tackle the complexities of text. And it doesn't matter if it's simple text or more complex text. They understand that the words on the page are more than just words that were randomly selected to be on the page, that they adhere to a text structure. So understanding and having a good grasp of what text structure can tell you is essential, and proficient readers leverage that. Similarly, that being able to identify text structure also amps up the ability to look for keywords and phrases, as well as being able to unpack the prompt, understand what's being asked, and applying that, what's going to be asked as they read. It also extends into being able to, develop a claim or an argument, and then connected with that, finding the evidence. That again, understanding that the words on the page didn't get there randomly; they're there by intention, and to be able to analyze and evaluate the evidence, and then finally bringing the whole thing together as a holistic package, how the evidence actually connects back to the claim or argument. And the great thing about this holds true across all of the content areas. No matter where the reading is occurring, this is true. And that's, I think, the splendid piece that gives instruction some leverage in terms of developing those skills. So let me just pause for a second. Susan, are there any questions or comments that we need to address in the question box?
Well, there are a couple of things, and I think with one of them, we're going to need to take a look back, and maybe we can do this at the very end. We'll go out to the GED website itself, but we had one question about where the scoring tool is located, and so I know that it's under the educator's resources, but we'll probably want to show people where that scoring tool is actually housed, because sometimes that may be a little harder to find. The other thing is we did have a question from Kathleen asking about whether or not there are any study recommendations or a customized study plan available for grad point with the GED. Is that one of the programs that's included, like when they do their enhanced score report, that you could select that one?
I don't know, but we can find out, and I may ask Debbie Fawcett while we're doing the talking if she could message somebody, and so that by the time we open the floor for questions that we can get that. But I can't say that I have an answer to that right now, but we'll get one. And hopefully by the time the webinar, by the time we wrap up the webinar.
Okay, I'm on it.
Okay, and I think that what we're doing at this point is, and Daphne, because I think your voice is fading in and out, and I'm hoping that mine isn't this time, but we've had a couple of notes that came in with that, so we'll try to be really careful with this as we're going through. There are a couple of other things that we do have questions that have come in. One of them is coming back to the scoring of the essay and on GED Ready. That is something that you as the instructor need to do, and in terms of going back in and doing a score. That's why we mentioned the scoring tool. But on the actual test, it is done through the automated scoring system. But there is a backup so that you have people who also are checking for that off and on. So there's some different things that can be going through with that. Then we have one other thing. For international students, there is challenge of new to American world. They never are. Okay, and I'm assuming you're talking specifically about American history being an issue. And so that's something that we'll try to address as we get on in to some of the stuff with the social studies. So
Yes.
I'll make sure that we've marked that from Hamid and make sure that we address that again when we come back into that one. So, and I think at this point we're getting a thumbs up from people in terms of being able to hear us better.
Okay. I had to take myself off the handset and put it actually on speaker. So I apologize for that. We're going to move on and talk a little bit about reasoning through language arts. And we're not going to spend a lot of time here. I'm going to talk briefly about a 30,000-foot view of the RLA test. You've heard us make reference to the fact that it's an integrated test of reading and writing, requires close reading skills, the ability to write clearly, and some editing skills, and certainly an understanding of standard written English in context. The source texts that are going to appear on the operating test, 75% nonfiction / informational text. Those are the kinds of texts that students will encounter in the workplace if they are going directly to work or to vocational or job training programs, as well as in the workplace. 25% fiction. So those of you out there who majored in literature, we've not completely abandoned literature, and I can say that because I was an English major in college. Passage length, those of you who are veterans of the 2002 series test will see that the passage length is substantially longer than in the 2002 test. And there's a range of text complexity. And because this test also can identify folks whose skills are at the higher ends of the continuum, as in college ready or college and career ready, there are going to be some tests at that level. And of course, we have technology enhanced items, and we have the extended response. So I'm going to dive into the first score report. This is what we call a de-identified score report. The identifying markers, name, etc., have been removed. But this is actually a real score report. The test taker took this test in January of this year and scored a 139, which falls in the too close to call range or yellow zone. And so the first place we're going to look is at the how I can score higher tab. And as you can see, the skills are listed, but there's an overarching category, reading for meaning. And here's where, in this particular case, we didn't have the insight about which publishers that the individual used, but this is where the score report becomes more specifically tied to the information, to the curriculum that you're using in your program. So if we had selected a publisher, you would see, as Susan indicated, the chapters and the pages that these specific skills are covered under. So you've got, the skills that can improve. And it's not really surprising. There's analyzing how details develop the main idea. That's a text structure issue. Analyzing the organization of a paragraph or passage, how that supports an author's idea. Infer, that is one of our students' least favorite skills, because they think that inferring means that they're running the risk of being wrong. But we all know that inference is not about a wild guess. It's about an informed reading between the lines to understand what is being implicitly stated rather than explicitly stated. So you see where the categories under reading for the details under reading for meaning are laid out. Second, identifying and creating arguments. Well, that's one of the key cornerstones to constructive response. And you can see, again, there's a theme here: understanding main ideas and details, being able to determine the main idea. These are all things that speak directly to the structure of the writing, how the argument is developed, what is used to develop the ideas, and then identifying evidence to support a claim or conclusion. And so the next category then drops into additional skills to work on. So these are the skills that, when worked on, give you actually the lift you need to wind up in the green zone. And those are things like determining there's a theme here again, determining the author's point of view, analyzing how an author uses rhetorical techniques, correcting errors with frequently confused words. Those are the additional skills that can actually boost scores. So, if we look at one of the things that we've heard from instructors is the fact that, okay, I looked down this list and I just gave you the quick overview of the territory that has to be covered. And so when you look closely at what those things are, these are directly from the score report. Really, all of these things relate to close reading. So the reason why we organized it this way is that looking at those items one at a time can be overwhelming, because there are 5 or 6 things that, all fall under that category. So what we're suggesting is you pull back and up a little bit to look at, well, what's the general category of skill? Don't get focused so much on the details of, what's being laid out here. How, what is the real skill that's being called for here? And in this particular case, it's close reading, with all of the things that close reading require. The inference one is pretty, straightforward. To make inferences about plots, sequences of events, characters, settings, and ideas. And so students need work on what do you do, and what is inference. And so, in terms of the diagnostic part of this, the determining what's missing, in the first column, you see what the score report feedback looks like. And then the diagnosis, tracks back to that. Close reading skills, the ability to engage with the text. Okay, those are the 2 cornerstones, and those are things that you can begin to work with students in the classroom. So let's extend that diagnosis a little bit. The test taker, given the feedback, also needs to work with the most common text structures: description, sequence, problem and solution, compare and contrast, and cause and effect. Every one of those text structures also has signal words that students can pick out of the reading and know that, oh, this is a compare and contrast. Oh, this is a problem and solution. So that way, they actually can engage more productively, quicker with the text. And the last piece is there were several items that spoke to evidence. And so what's called for here is not just a broader definition of what evidence is. And I want to make sure that I say students need that, because they are inclined, to decide that a passage doesn't have evidence if there isn't a table with numbers in it, or there isn't a research study that's referenced. But there are a ton of other pieces of evidence that may be used by a writer, anecdotes, personal examples, emotional appeal, all of those things constitute evidence. So students need to extend, and you need to help them extend their definition of evidence beyond just saying it's facts and figures. And particularly to look at how evidence is used to support a position or a conclusion in the text. So Susan, given all that, how do we go about addressing areas for improvement?
Well, there's a number of different things that that we need to work with. And I think one of those especially comes back to, looking at that text structure. But, we have to get our students to the point, as you said, where they've got to be able to go in and they've got to be able to identify details. They've got to be able to move on in and be able to get, that main idea or that central idea out of, different texts that they read. And they've got to be able to see some of those relationships that are going on. Because our students tend to be more skimmers and scanners rather than close readers, that becomes a difficult thing for them, is to be able to do those relationships and see how, how is it that the first sentence in a paragraph is related to how the paragraph ends? What is the relationship there, and what is the relationship between this paragraph to that, and how things have transitioned through writing? I think that's one of the really big problems that we see with so many students that are out there. And then they really have to look at evidence. And how does what that author is saying, how does that author back that up? What are they using as the proof? And you brought up a really good point that, it's one of the fast and easy things is let me look for a percent. Let me look for, a year. Let me look for a quote. But there's so much more that's involved, and part of that comes back to relationship. So there's a number of different things that we can do in working with and helping them identify and create those arguments. And I think one thing that students have to understand, and they don't always understand, is that when they're reading something and getting prepared to do that extended response, they're not looking at the fact that the text they're reading is actually a claim unto itself that has evidence backing it up. They're just focusing on, I've got to write my own claim instead. But there's some other things where they've got to look at some generalizations. Point of view becomes another one that's difficult. And why is the author saying what the author is saying? What's the purpose behind it? And how does that author turn around and use those rhetorical techniques in order to get you to that purpose? But the other thing for our students, and this is not just our students, my Lord, all you got to do is look in papers and books and everything now, is to see these errors with frequently confused words and how students have such difficulty, deciding, do I use to, or the other two? And what do I do within some of those? What's the difference between an affect and effect? And there's so many different things that our students need from that direction as well. So,
yeah.
If we're taking a look at some of those individual pieces, we have to go from there into looking at that diagnosis. So again, what are we coming back to? Our text structure, those descriptions, those signal words, and then again, that evidence. And what's going to happen next as we're going through? Well, we're going to prescribe. So we're going to start looking at some other things. And all of you who are here that have been with us before, you probably heard it until you're like, don't mention it again. It's the performance level descriptors, because that really tells us what we need to be working on so that we can move students from a level 1 to that level 2, which is passing. Or if a student's at level 2 and we know they want to go forward and go on to college and technical training, how do we get them to level 3? These become such important things. But the other piece does come back to those high impact indicators, because those work across the content areas. And so that can make a huge difference. One other thing that I think most of you, we did a session where we talked about things that were on the new, I'll put it in quotes. You can't see my air quotes, but the new study guides that are actually on the GED website, those are great for students to review, because they have all these different types of questions that are included in there that they can work through some of those individual pieces. So, take some time and if you haven't already, or if you're new to adult ed and, you're just getting started with some of this, then get started with the content, looking at all those different pieces that are there. But again, I want to go back and emphasize that it is all about the relationships. Those high impact indicators, if we focus our energy there, think about the payoff that you get. If we can help students really understand, a premise and see, be able to evaluate, support, and evidence, that's not just about writing. That comes into social studies. I mean, the other thing that can come into, as well as it can come over into looking at, technical texts that students are reading and things that are there in science. I mean, there's so much that we can get from those individual pieces if we use them. So let's go back to and talk just a minute about our too close to call test taker.
Yes.
What we have to do as we look at this is now, Daphne, what happens if you have that too close to call test taker and they go ahead and test?
Well, what we found in all the instances that folks are going to see here today is that the operational exam, not surprisingly, identifies precisely the same elements that were identified on the GED Ready score reports as needing attention. And it's not surprising, because as we, led off with this, that the GED Ready is normed and standardized the same way as the operational test. So it should be predictive, and it is. And so this, the 139 that the test taker scored on the GED Ready RLA became a 137 on the RLA live test. Not surprising that this happened. It is totally within the realm. And the reason why we elected to, make these comparisons today on this webinar is that these are the students who fall in the yellow zone. These are the students that particularly need your attention and guidance. Wouldn't you agree, Susan?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So, those are the kinds of things that, we have to be so cautious about in terms of, because Daphne, let's go back to what we were talking about in terms of motivation and disappointment and those kinds of things, that, if we see those students who are too close to call, we've got to do that encouragement and that instruction to make sure that when they do get to move to that operational test, it's a success for them.
Right. Correct. And that is why we're bringing this particular slant to you today. That in order for them to move ahead, when they get a too close to call, in 9 cases, they're needing attention to critical areas to ensure that they can be successful when they test operationally.
Absolutely. Okay. And before we move into social studies, we have just a couple of questions that I think we need to just take a quick minute to talk about. So one of the questions that we have had, actually we've had it a couple of times, Daphne, is that would people want to know if they can get some of those slides. And yes, they are there, folks. In fact, if you look in your dashboard, you'll notice that they're under a little tab, it says handouts. There are actually 3 handouts that are there. So you can certainly have those. You can download them at any time as you're going through this. It'll just download to your computer. Or if you want to wait, you can get those slides when they're posted on the GED website, which will be in the next couple of days, because generally they do this very quickly after, because we have recorded this, or I should say we are recording this, and so that will be posted as well. So you need to make sure that that you do that and that you get those resources, because they can be very helpful. The other thing is that we do have a comment from Rick, who are actually some questions about, are we asking students to just recognize evidence? Are we asking them to evaluate the evidence as well? And yes, they are being asked to do both, analyze and evaluate, so that they can make a determination as to which one of those authors has presented, has most strongly supported the argument that they've made. And so I do know that, when we get through, I'm going to ask you to kind of separate out what you might be required to do in college versus what you might be asked to do on the GED test, because there's a number of different categories of evidence that students can use. We're not at that college level writing yet. We want our students to be there. But what you do, so I know that people will think, yeah, but anecdotal, those examples, that's just not as strong as other evidence. What we're asking students to do is to provide evidence from the text. And they're being able to even recognize that anecdotal evidence is provided is important for our students. Keep in mind what they are doing at this particular point in time. So they will not always have multiple facts, in that, well, they may have multiple facts, but maybe they won't have multiple stats in a text that they're reading. But that doesn't mean that there isn't other evidence, professional expertise, that you have from someone that's provided in that. You may also have,
expert opinion.
Expert opinion. Thank you.
Somebody who is an acknowledged expert in a field, or an organization that is an acknowledged. Yeah.
So those are the kinds of things. And what we would encourage you to do is to really take a look at the resources that are on the GED Testing Service website that talk, and especially the guides that go along with the extended response, to see how some of that is handled. I think that, what we want to do at this particular point in time is, yes, we can make that distinction for students about when they enter a college class. The professor is going to say, this is the evidence you should be presenting, and I want this kind, and this is the only thing accepted, but that we do have some other possibilities here. So another thing that you may want to take advantage of is we do have a 2-part writing webinar that we did, which will also provide a little bit more information on the issue of using evidence and supporting your position when you write your claim. One other thing that Daphne, that they have asked is, what percent of the students that make a passing grade on the GED Ready test go on and make a passing grade on the real, I'm assuming that's operational test?
It is about in the it's in the mid-70s range, or 80s range, and that has to take into consideration that there are multiple attempts allowed. Does that make sense?
The last
Yeah, and the last numbers I heard was 83% validity in the scoring of the test, comparative to what they do on the other tests. I'm sorry, but thought I'd add that in.
No,
yeah.
No, thank you. That's good for us, all of us, to know. And we have a couple of other questions that are still coming in, but why don't we go ahead, Daphne, and let's take a look into very quickly, because I know that we have a good bit to cover. But we'll go ahead and take a look at social studies and our science as well.
Yes, and I just want to, we're going to breeze through social studies pretty quickly, because really what I want you to take away from that is that they are the same skills that we just looked at in RLA, but the context is different. So just keep that in mind as we move through. Okay, I seem to have, hold on a second. Okay, so I think there was a question earlier about the content of the social studies. So a good 70% of it revolves around civics and government, 50% civics and government, U.S., 20% U.S. history. So there's a fairly significant percentage of the content that is, U.S. driven. 15% economics and 15% geography in the world. We've got two themes that help organize the content area: the development of modern liberties and democracy, and the dynamic responses in societal systems. If you want to know more about these, I would suggest that you utilize the website to take a look at the assessment guide for educators, because all of the underlying detail about the themes and content are contained there. And the focus is on social studies practices, analyzing, thinking, and reasoning. This is at its heart. All of the content area tests are reasoning tests. And of course, we have technology enhanced items as part of the mixture.
Daphne, if I could for just a minute, for those who are involved in instruction on an international basis, yes, we do know that civics and government and United States history can be a little challenging. There is some content that we recommend that you focus on in looking at that. I would, just as Daphne had mentioned, I would recommend that one of the things that you do is take a look at the one of the webinars that we have in the archives that actually addresses social studies, because I do know that for students, whether they're in Indonesia or they're in South Africa or wherever they might be, that the U.S. history and government is a bit of a challenge. So there is some content that would be helpful to them. But as Daphne's looking at this social studies ready, what we see here though is, oh my gosh, that second circle, reading for meaning. Daphne, we're right back to where we were talking about before.
Same skills, different context. That's that's the name of the game here. And part of your mission as instructors is to help students understand that there aren't boxes that you put these skills in. They are skills for all content areas. You need analysis in language arts, you need analysis in social studies, you need analysis in mathematical reasoning, you need analysis in science. Okay, so don't allow students to sort of say, oh, well, this is a skill that I'm going to use over here in this content area exclusively. That isn't the way for them and you to get the most out of your instructional time together. So Susan, thanks for, pointing that it's the same. These are the same skills. Students would be
kind of surprised at what numbers in social studies. Well, take a look. You've got to be able to analyze information from maps, tables, charts. You've got to interpret and use graphs with the appropriate labeling. If you want to get a flavor for that, the item samplers, which feature the technology enhanced items, will show you some of the ways that those quantitative skills get deployed in social studies. They're available on the GED.com website on the instructor side as tools for instruction. So the point here is that these skills, once developed, your task is to get students to understand. Don't tuck them away in your back pocket. You need them for all the content areas. Again, the areas for improvement, inference. Okay, we saw that over in language arts. Comparison. That's one of the text structures. To the extent that you're comfortable with the text structures, you can make those comparisons. You can identify those comparisons. You have signal words that tell you over here it's this. In contrast, over here it looks like that. So students can be primed to look for those things. In social studies, we have things like cause and effect. It's not just in science, it's also in social studies. And so being able to identify events and arguments in social studies. Again, where do we see arguments? We saw it in language arts. We'll see it again, evidence and arguments in science as well. The vocabulary may be a little bit different, but it's the same skill. And then, yes, math, we keep in front of them, yes, math has a role in social studies, as it does in science, so not just in mathematical reasoning. So being able to interpret, use, and create graphs doesn't just happen when you're plotting points on a coordinate plane. It happens with live information and data that actually is generated by social studies resources. Again, the skills to work on, logical inferences, central ideas, right out of the RLA playbook. The difference between fact and opinion, part of the analysis and evaluation part of RLA and of constructive response, pulling specific evidence. All the content areas have that in common. Being able to describe the relationships and the connections between things like people, places, processes, and events. The same thing that happens in the literary context, it also happens in social studies. Cause and effect relationships and being able to work with those effectively, including those that are incredibly complex and have multiple factors. I would call your attention to something like climate change. There isn't just one factor, there are multiple factors contributing. And so those are the kinds of skills, again, that overlap content areas, and once developed, the great thing about higher order thinking skills is that they become accessible for students to use regardless of content areas. So help them keep their minds open and always include, as you're teaching a skill, one of the classic simple questions you can ask students at the end of a unit is, where else can you use this? A very simple question, but a very powerful one potentially in terms of getting them to extend their repertoire. So here's what the diagnosis, yields. Again, close reading, being able to engage with social studies text, being able to infer. Again, not a wild guess, but taking what's there and understanding what is implicitly meant by what's there. And then mathematical reasoning, in the social studies context. Susan, do you want to talk briefly about inference and, the whole processing that goes on with inference? Because I think students think that it's some kind of mystery cauldron that, they can't figure out, how do I stir this the right way?
Sure. A couple of things here is that our students, when they read, they think inference is a real problem. But if they begin to relate the fact that they use inference all the time in their personal interactions with other people, they begin to put the pieces together, because we all do this all the time. We're making inferences as we go through. If we see someone outside and they have a heavy coat on, we infer that it is cold out there. Our students don't think about that as being this same type of thing that you do when you're reading, where you read and you get information from the text itself, and you make connections with that in part based on things that you know. It's not a wild guess. It is taking knowledge that you have and combining that with what has been presented, and then thinking critically about it. But here's part of the problem that we have with inference, is that we start to teach inference in a much more complex way than we should. We should be starting in teaching inference itself. We should move from very simple to the more complex. Our text basically moves students into that situation where they're reading a narrative, maybe a couple paragraphs long, and they have to make inferences from that. The reality is that we really should be starting with something as simple as starting with advertisements. That can be one of the first things that students do, or use cartoons or comics and get that underlying note of what is being inferred by what they see. There's a wonderful advertisement that, in fact, Super Bowl advertisements are some of the best in the world to use for making inferences. But you can look at this as a comic, and it's about students having what they see, and then what would they know about excuses, about not having your homework done. So when that student is saying, I ate my homework, in this case, it's not the dog that ate it. The student actually ate it, because here's a student who's in culinary school. I mean, those are the kinds of things where we start in a simple manner, and then we move those into much more complex. If you do that, then inferences don't have to be this, scary thing that students are trying to take on. So those are the things that we need to be doing as we're moving through. And, Daphne, I think as we're going through, if we take a look at this again, how do those students fare when they're taking the operational test versus GED? If they're in that too close to call, guess what happens? They're still going to have the problems. They're still going to have those same issues that they needed improvement on and that we didn't see. I know that we're going to, in just we're going to try to quickly go through and talk about a little bit about mathematical reasoning, because we've been answering questions as we've been going along. But, we realize that we have about 30 more minutes as we're moving through this. And so let's talk just a little bit, Daphne, about mathematical reasoning and what we can do within that.
Okay, this is this is often the test that is left until last, and it's probably the test that has the most emotional baggage associated with it. Here is a student who scored a 136 on the GED Ready math, and that's at the very end, pretty much, of the yellow zone. And you can see I've highlighted the areas that the student needed improvement in. Basic math. Those are the kinds of issues that You find on the calculator prohibited items, the first 5 questions. So they are really fundamentals, like being able to work with a number line or knowing the distance between numbers on a number line. And in as far as geometry is concerned, being able to work with the basic geometric concepts, and also being able, to construct and explain data from bar graphs and circle graphs and dot plots as well as histograms. So a component of not only mathematical literacy, but visual and data literacy as well. Basic algebra, an issue here. Being able to solve inequality is one example. Graphs and functions also. And then there's a laundry list of skills to work on, to get into the green zone. And this is where I'll, say that what we said earlier about using the performance level descriptors for, comparing student performance against the not passing level and the high school equivalency will give you a place to depart from in terms of figuring that out. So the things that stand out in this score report and the feedback, a need for problem solving, some basic problem solving techniques, getting comfortable with geometric reasoning, as well as, the real basics, the algebra basics, and not just the processes, but the concepts, because that's what, is absent here. And, we can take a look at some additional skills, and those are the skills that are not completely absent in the test taker, but they are skills that the test taker was, as Susan mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, were inconsistent, meaning that a small wrinkle in how the problem is presented, a student didn't necessarily got it right the first time because there was a pretty straightforward presentation of the problem, and they could identify it as, I know how to do this. And a small wrinkle, 15 items later, same skill, but the student completely missed it because there was a little wrinkle in the problem. So these are the kinds of things that are often found in the additional skills list, and you can see that they are a variety, but there are some problem-solving issues. There are some geometry issues, the side length of triangles and rectangles when they're given the area or perimeter. One thing to tell your math students is that, although they may learn the formula for calculating the area of a triangle, we're not going to ask them that on the GED test. We're going to give them the area, and we may ask them to find a side length, the height or the base, based on what you know about what the area is. So something to keep in mind, because it is about reasoning. It isn't about rote. We do not really want them, we're not testing them to see if they can memorize the formulas and, regurgitate those formulas. We have a formula sheet that takes care of that. It's much more important for them to understand the concept behind calculating area, the concept behind calculating surface area, than it is to actually remember, take up brain space remembering those formulas. The diagnosis is pretty, you saw the list. So this is a student that learned some of the basics, but has some holes in, the next step up. And this is where the performance level descriptors could play a role in terms of helping you determine where the student falls on the math skills continuum. And a note to the wise, which I'm sure people already know, but just a reminder that keep in mind the skills that have to be in place as you move up the math continuum. You can't. I think I said this earlier with one of the other score reports. You can't plot points on a coordinate plane if you are not comfortable working with a number line. So make sure the foundations are in place as you move through. Susan, let's just briefly talk a little bit about the value of mathematical reasoning and, why this is such a fundamental skill.
Well, I want to take it in addition to this. I mean, the whole idea of being able to, the real reason why we need math is not so that we can sit there and do computations every day, pages of them. The real thing is to be able to use it and to be able to think through what needs to be done in order for something to make sense. And so that's why when Daphne made the comment about, we're not looking for rote. We're looking for students to really understand the why and the how, that they have strategies that they can use when they go to solve problems. Or we have a fancy word on this slide called heuristics, and those are really different strategies that students can use in working through, because all of us, we have those types of things. So we want students to know that they encounter something and they're at a store and they're going to see something is on sale, that they know how to calculate that percentage, or that they even recognize that that's what I'm supposed to do in order to find out, is it a good deal or is it not? So we want students to be able to move forward and actually go through and take this, math and use it. But the other thing is that we have to talk about having students know that they can do problems in different ways, that just because the book says, oh, in this one you must use a formula, doesn't mean that that's what you have to do. Probably one of the best things within this is that sometimes students will encounter a slope problem, and the formula looks so darn intimidating to them. And so if they realize what it's really asking, they can just use basic math. It may take a little bit longer to get there than the formula, but if the formula intimidates you and you can do it using just basic computations, then do that. But students sometimes need our permission for that to happen. I want to talk for just 1 minute, and I'm not going to go into all of the slides, but when it comes to word problems, we talk about reading and reasoning, and this, I want you to just think in terms of how you go about solving a problem. You're sitting there working with your students, and the student says, I don't know how to do this. So the first thing that you do is you go through and you do an initial reading of that problem. You're reading it just to understand what it's asking you to do. You're trying to get all your facts kind of lined up and begin that process. We just call it noticing. We're noticing different things about it. We're noticing what the question is asking us to do. But then there's a second read. And in that second read, and if we do it and we don't even think about it, we're really at that point saying, okay, I've read the problem. I know what it's asking, the question is asking, but now I got to go through and figure out how am I going to go about solving it. So now I'm actually getting into my strategies. And so those are the things that we do naturally. And then after we've done that problem, we go back and we read it again. And we look to see, well, did I head in the right direction for this? That's the critical thinking that students need to do in order to move through problems. They have to read and reason. And if you were to tell a student now, you're going to need to read the problem 3 times, the first thing they're going to say to you is, I don't have time to do that. This is a time test. They don't have time not to do this, because if they don't take this kind of process and it becomes innate to them, they're going to have difficulty as they work through. So in looking at those particular things, what we want to do is we want to emphasize reading those problems, not just scanning them and finding the numbers. We want them to understand. We want them to organize the information that's there, see if there's anything missing, and then we want those preliminary ideas. So it's Daphne, if you would, I'm going to have you skip over a couple of slides here because I know our time is running short. But this one here, finding the cues in text. Sometimes it's just a matter that our students can't come up with an answer. They don't know what to do because they're missing out on the terms. And, when they have the word difference in there, do they always recognize that that is subtraction? If they're asked to find a quotient, do they think that's multiplication, or do they know that that's division? Those are the kinds of things that we have to work with. And I'll share one more. If we're talking about that slope problem again, if we had something what's going to increase at the same rate, well, that's not just one word, that's a little phrase, but that phrase is the clue. It's the cue that says, oh, this is what I'm looking for. So we've got to be really cautious with that. And just a couple of other quick things. There's so many graphic organizers that are out there. Not all graphic organizers work for all students, but at the same time, for some students, it is absolutely essential that they have a way to organize their information. And I would just, tell you to please keep that in mind going through, that maybe there are some students who are struggling in some cases with doing word problems, and the reason for their struggle really comes back to they need a sense of structure, and they need that organizational tool for them.
And I'd like to add at this point that the graphic organizer use is a plus for you as instructors, because it's going to actually make the thinking visible, and it's going to give you some insight into where student skills need shoring up.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So again, when we say meeting the challenge, if there's one thing I would say to anyone working with students and with mathematics, is you have to get them to understand why. Why do we have to do a certain thing when we're working with fractions? Why do we do this? Understanding that concept is what we want our students to do, because if they have the concept, they have the knowledge that they can use in lots of different situations.
That is so true. And let me tell you about our too close to call test taker. I know you're not surprised by this. The operational exam feedback was identical to the GED Ready feedback. All of the areas that we've just talked about are highlighted as the student needing work and development, skill development in, were those that were featured on the operational exam feedback.
And we just had Alan share for everybody, and I responded to this question, sending to all, that mathbits.com is an excellent online source for graphic organizers. So, Alan, thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Yes. We are going to briefly talk about science, and then we're going to, I seem to be losing my power, so give me a second. We're going to briefly overview the science test. I think there are no surprises here. There's a pretty nice distribution between life science, physical science, and earth and space science. Two themes to organize it all: human health and living systems, and energy and related systems. Those, using the content and the themes together actually provide students with an integrated real-world focus on science, not, bounded by these intensely abstract theoretical things. As we talked about, and Susan talked about in mathematical reasoning, the science is an integral part of, who we are as living beings and the environment that we operate in. And the task in attacking science from a conceptual view is to anchor it in the real. And that's, kind of, the advice to this. Now, this is someone who's at the higher end of the too close to call. But again, our friend reading is figuring prominently, designing and interpreting science experiments, scientific inquiry, scientific methods, right at the heart of things. So if it's the big idea in science, and getting that from a practical and conceptual standpoint kind of opens up students' ability to work with scientific concepts and to work with the idea of experimentation. And our old friend, mathematical reasoning, makes an appearance, just like social studies, in science as well. So we've got a little wardrobe of additional skills, identifying and refining hypotheses for scientific investigations. Our old friend evidence, that has, figured prominently in all of the other content areas, is right here as well. Making judgments. That's what we do in RLA by selecting a point of view that is better supported, and being able to marshal the evidence to that. So the connections between and among the content areas are resident as well in science. We've got the close reading, scientific method, and math and science as being the areas for the test taker to improve. So we're back to, square one in terms of close reading. We really weren't kidding about close reading being essential, being able to engage with the text, and also pulling inferences or reading between the lines, also important. This particular test taker went on to get 2 more points, as opposed to our other examples where they lost points, got 2 more points, but did not make the passing cut score of 145. And the same areas are featured for needing improvement. It's the same feedback from the Science GED Ready. So before we take some questions, I think we have a couple of minutes for questions, but we want to leave you with a few takeaways. Make sure, I'm going to echo something that I've said and Susan has said as part of this webinar. Really promote the idea to students that there are many effective ways to do things, whether it's writing, problem solving, or thinking analytically or scientifically. For you as instructors, we totally understand that you have a limited amount of time, but you do have to be willing to repeat teach, because unfortunately, that's not how our heads work. Once is almost never enough when students are trying to learn a concept. The third point is that we would wish that skill development and learning were linear, but they're not. And so you have to have the patience to flow with the plateaus when they occur, because folks, adult learners in particular, need time to integrate the learning into what they already know. And to that last point, it's both iterative and integrative, because it'll enable you, by accepting this and embracing this, it's going to enable you to expect the best and have your students rise to giving their best. Those are really important things. The dynamic in the adult ed classroom, you're obviously instructors dealing with concepts, but as to go back to something Susan said earlier, you're also cheerleaders and confidence builders. And so you've got to balance all of that in an already complex environment. Okay, Susan, where do we want to go from here, and do we have questions?
Well, we've been answering questions along. I will just say that a couple of items that came up, we had someone who says, well, if the word infer, just by itself is creating a problem, maybe there's another word we can use for that. But I think at the same time, our students really need to understand that, making inferences goes beyond just drawing conclusions. And so we've got to build our students all the way through, but we can do that if we just stay focused on some of that. I will ask Debbie, were you able to find out anything about grad point?
Yes, I was. And I looked on the website first for Grad Point. I do see that it is a credit recovery program for K-12. So it is not on our published list. And I did put an answer in the question box. But the thing I wanted as for your information, the publishers that you see there are publishers who chose to bring their product to us to say they would like to be listed. They went through a vetting process so that we could show that they did have alignment to our curriculum. So for whatever reason, GradPoint has not reached out to us to do that type of alignment. And so that's why you don't see it in the list of publishers' materials.
Okay. And then there's just one, if we can do one other thing, and Debbie, I will ask you this. Will the science test be returning to those short answers in 2019?
For 2019, the answer is no. When the short answers were removed, we learned to never say never, but that they would never be returned, but we will not be returning them in 2019. And we don't know that there is any consideration to re-enter them, but I can tell you in 2019 it won't happen.
Okay, that is good to know. And we do have another question that asking about some online material for science practice. And I could what I'll do is I'll refer people out to the GED.com website and look on the archives for the webinar that dealt with science, and you'll find lots of information there. The same thing that we came across in looking at social studies. Again, there's lots of information that's included in those webinars, and you can access those at any time. As far as the math, we have from Zoe, what level of math is required for social studies and science. Keep in mind that the math that we're looking at in those levels, actually we're talking about students being able to do mean, median, mode, range. You're not talking about high-level complex math like, doing tons of science equations. So I would encourage you to take a look at the PLDs, and that will give you some specifics as you go through. But we have one other one, and either Debbie or Daphne, you can answer this for us. Fran had a student who did great on the GED Ready. In fact, scored at 163, but took the GED test and scored a 143. It was a retest. So, and it was RLA. So either one of you want to take that? Debbie, you want to take that one on?
I would say that my first thought is to see a discrepancy that great would be test anxiety as a big portion of what's going on. Daphne, I don't know what else you'd like to read into it. That one other thing I want to say that goes to something that I saw in a question from someone from our correctional facilities who stated that anyone in their group who scored too close to call did not pass the test. I will tell you all that Marty Kay, who's our vice president of assessment, answered that question in our Train the Trainer group when someone said, well, my people who scored, why do you have a too close to call at that low a range? And Marty responded that more than 70% at the lowest range of too close to call could pass the test. So yes, it's a range, But if 70% could pass it, they wanted to give that 70% the opportunity to know that they may pass the test, even if they scored at the lowest range of too close to call. The other side of that is when you look at the 83%, comparison to people who scored, at a certain range and then passed the test. When you look at that difference, that tells you that there are a lot of people that are out prepared. But if you're too close to call if I were teaching, and you probably all do this too, if they're too close to call and on the lower end of it, I think I would give them good counsel that I'm not sure I would take a shot quite yet, even though Marty can tell us that 70% of them will pull through on the test. It's just a conversation, and that's where your counsel becomes very important to your students.
Well, the other thing too is that the one accompanying additional piece of information that I'd like to add to what Debbie just said is the fact that we also see, when we look in GED Manager, students who take a number of GED Ready, thinking that that's the optimal way to prepare for the test. It really isn't, because without addressing the information that's on the score report, which was the whole point of the webinar today, students don't actually have an opportunity to address their. And so often what happens is that they become proficient at taking the GED Ready, and they can get those higher scores, but they haven't really addressed all of the underlying fundamentals that could, securely put them in the passing zone. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And the environment under which you take the GED Ready, it's not the operational test, and you're not going to be credentialed. So like Debbie said, test anxiety, really does nibble away at performance, which is why you want students to go and be prepared and confident. So no matter what they are facing, there are no surprises, and they can give the best performance.
We have just one more that I would like to come back into. People have asked about certificates, and yes, you can get a certificate for being with us today. It is under the handouts, but just like everything else, it will also be on the GED website as well. So you can pick up that when they've loaded everything on there. Just give a couple of days in order for that to happen. And with that being said, Debbie, any comments?
Yeah, I certainly do. And I'm going to have a very self-serving comment at this point, because when Susan and I conduct the next webinar in December, we don't want to answer all the questions about where did Daphne go. So I want to take this opportunity to tell those of you who don't know it that my dear friend and colleague for the last 8 to 9 years at GED Testing Service is happily moving to another chapter in her career, and she will be leaving us on Monday. And I cannot tell you what a loss that is to me, both personally. Well, I'm not losing her as a personal friend, but as a professional friend who has guided so much of this. So Daphne, we just wanted to say goodbye in a big hoo-ha way, so nobody will ask us a lot of questions next time. So give us a farewell, and we're out of here.
Okay. For those of you who have come up to engage with us as we've moved, we've been at conferences, I just want to give you a huge thank you for being fans of this. When we started, we didn't know how successful or whether it would remain of interest to you. And, Debbie is right. I am going to leave to take a more active role in helping you produce better results in the classroom. So I will see some of along the way, and I'm really grateful for that part of it. I also want to extend my profound thanks to Susan Pittman and Debbie Fawcett, because they have been an absolute joy to work with. And I hope we'll still be able to work in some capacity together in the future. And, you know, most of all, I want to give all of you a thank you, not only a personal thank you, but on behalf of GED Testing Service, because you have certainly risen to the challenge, and you keep rising to the challenge. And we are so thankful for you, and we are so grateful for the work that you do every single day. So thank you. And you're right, Debbie, we're out.
We're out. Thank you so much,
Thank you,
folks.
everybody.
Bye-bye.